each of their lives surprised me. Part of the fun of the exercise of writing the book was to really get to know them as characters. Who were the people who enabled such extraordinary creations, such extraordinary feats of the imagination, feats of the human intellect? Over and over again, I was just struck about how human they were, and how fallible, and how venal, and how petty, and how funny in so many ways.
All right, everybody. I am here with William Egginton. His newest book is called The Rigor of Angels, Borges, Heisenberg, Kant, and the Ultimate Nature of Reality. William is a professor at Johns Hopkins, and he's also written very interesting books in the past as well, which might come up a little bit today. But first of all, William, just want to thank you for coming on the podcast.
Justin, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to talk about your new book, which I very much enjoyed reading. I would say the main conceit of the book is that these three different thinkers, Borges, Heisenberg, and Kant, working in different disciplines, different places, all come to the same conclusion around the same time. And essentially, that conclusion is, to put it in my own words, something like that reality contains these, what you call crevices of unreason, these eternal crevices of unreason, and that no matter how hard we try to comprehend the world, there will always remain these irreducible pockets of paradox and uncertainty, in large part introduced by ourselves as observers. Is there anything you would add or subtract to that, just as a starting point for the conversation?
No, that's a really nice kind of summation of what I'm trying to do in the book. The one thing I would say is that Heisenberg, as it turns out, of these three characters that I'm writing about and telling the stories of, Heisenberg, the physicist, and Borges, the poet and short story writer, they lived more or less about the same historical time period, right? Very end of 19th, beginning of 18th, beginning of the 20th century, their lives spanning almost to the end of the 20th century, to the 1970s in Heisenberg's case, 1980s in Borges' case. And both of them had a relationship to Kant, who died like a century earlier. So there's kind of a triangle in time, with Kant having come to these things first, and then the poet and the physicist both having a relationship to Kant, but them living these lives that largely didn't touch each other, but ended up from very different perspectives, like you were saying, from very, very different fields, coming to remarkably similar conclusions about the nature of reality and our relationship to it.
Okay, excellent. Excellent. That's an important wrinkle there. And the title of the book, The Rigor of Angels, is an allusion to Borges, who says that there is rigor in the world, but it is the rigor of chess masters, not of angels. So I want to unpack that a little bit, because it's kind of interesting. When you read just Borges, he could mean that rigor is just not the business of angels. But you said the title of the book is kind of implying that what he really means is that there is a rigor of angels. What is the rigor of angels? I would love for you to explain in your own perspective. What is that rigor that is practiced by angels?
So it's a really great question, and the title is one that came to me. This is, I have to say, of all the books I wrote, the one that took me the longest to get to the title. And then when it came to me, I said to myself, well, look at this. I had a paper that I'd given like 20 years earlier that had this title that I had borrowed or stolen, really, from Borges. This was in front of my eyes the whole time. This is what the book needs to be about. And as you point out, it's kind of in some ways a negative, or the inverse impression of a title, in a way, because what Borges says at the end of this marvelous story, and when I teach it to my students, I sometimes refer to it as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, short story, in my opinion, ever written, Plön Uqvar Orbis Tertius. And the book begins, in fact, with an epigraph from that book, that very epigraph that I take the title from. At the end of this remarkable story, Borges talks about, he sort of projects himself into the future. He talks about a world that has been taken over by an idea. It's like this conspiracy theory of conspiracy theories, in a way. And the idea that he gets and he says it's something that we're all always bewitched by, is the possibility of some deeper meaning that's going to explain absolutely everything to us. And this is what he calls this rigor of angels, right? And the rigor of angels is essentially our desire, which is ineradicable in ourselves, to believe that ultimately the world is stitched together in some fundamental, reasonable, rational way that transcends us, but that's there waiting for us. And it's there waiting for us in a language that we can explain and a language that we can intimately grasp. And what he says at the end of that story is humanity forgets and forgets again that although there is rigor out there, it's a rigor of angels. It's a rigor of chess masters, not of angels, not of angels, right? So it's our belief. We have this faith. We have this desire for the rigor that we find in the world to be independent of us, to be out there. It's waiting for us. But in fact, we're constantly erasing our own work in creating that rigor. That's the difference, right? We do the rigor and then we work as hard as we can to erase our own footprints and to forget that we were there in the first place creating. We're the measure of the world in a way. It's our intellect that puts it together, and we put it together with our own tools and for our own understanding.
Yeah, I like that. It actually reminds me of some of your previous books. It seems like you've been grappling with this question for a long time. These questions about the antinomies of reality, and it seems to me, if I'm correct, if I may say so, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that you seem to think that really art is the solution to these problems at the end of the day. That we don't solve them intellectually, we don't solve them on paper, but we solve them through creativity, through artistic practice. You have a book about Cervantes, and I think you kind of read him as pioneering fiction as a kind of solution to these problems. You have a book about Baroque theater. You say that
Right.
it's the theater of truth, and that these questions of truth are kind of negotiated in these various art forms. Am I right to sense that is this where you come down ultimately on this question?
Well, in a way, yes, in the sense that, as you, Justin, are so correctly pointing out, over the last 20 to 30 years, I've been writing books largely from the perspective of the history of literature, the history of poetics, of aesthetics. But one of the points that I'm trying to really hammer home in this book is that these truths are available from a variety of different perspectives. And this is the first book in which I've really in depth gone into what you would call a hard scientific perspective by really working out the what's called in philosophy working from the perspective of foundations of physics. So fundamental questions in physics, and in this case, quantum mechanics, and to a certain extent, relativity as well. But that is something that I've been working on, uh, both in my reading, my writing, my thinking, but also in my teaching for again close to 30 years. It was just time to finally put it out there in this book in an extended, rigorous way, and to ultimately what you were getting at when you summarize the book so well is to show or to create a kind of even platform for all three of these different perspectives, right? These different human perspectives, one coming from observation and the natural sciences, another coming from just deep thought, thinking through what Kant would call the conditions of possibility of perceiving anything in the first place, and the other from storytelling, narrative, poetry, language, and how yes, in my own work, I've come over and over again to the idea that art reveals these truths to us. That's absolutely true. But I wanted to show that it didn't have to be exclusively art, that you can come to these truths through very rigorous thought of the nature of a great philosopher like Kant, or truly extraordinary leaps of observation and science, as Heisenberg did.
Okay, great. Yeah, that makes sense. You've kind of been building up to these ideas for a while, and this was your attempt to really try
Yes.
to look at the hard science of it. And that's interesting. And there are a lot of really interesting and surprising details in the book about the lives of these three thinkers and of how they came to their ideas. But you really do attempt to make this a kind of sweeping answer to some of the big questions in life about the nature of reality, about free will versus determinism, or whether reality is discrete or continuous. These are kind of the big questions that you point this book at, and you hope to, through your reading of Borges and Heisenberg and Kant, shed some light on these big fundamental questions. So I'm curious to ask you, how did writing the book change your mind on these topics? When you finished the book, did you kind of update your probability of free will? Did you increase that probability, or did you decrease that probability, or maybe some other related question? What were the biggest changes in your beliefs that were updated in the process of writing this book?
Oh, that's such a great question. It's such a great question. Um, Yes, in many ways I did. And I think the most important thing that this book allowed me to do or forced me to do was to challenge some of my own beliefs, because these are really hard thinkers to grapple with. The question of Heisenberg and free will, this is an absolutely brilliant one. I went back and forth with a philosopher friend of mine, a colleague of mine, and we talked about this. And he said, this is really hard to understand how you can bring Kant together, Kant, who in some ways, certainly in his mechanistic view of the universe, really had what you could call a Laplacian understanding, right? We mentioned the great, really philosopher of science, Laplace, who had posited this demon, the Laplacian demon, right? The idea that if this all-knowing demon were to know the position and movement of every particle in the universe at every time, there'd be no such thing as free will, because you'd be able to know every single step from here on to eternity of what's going to happen to everything. And Kant, in some ways, and this is really true, his mechanistic understanding of the universe absolutely, he absolutely buys that. Whereas Heisenberg himself says, my biggest contribution at a philosophical level is the destruction of this notion of a Laplacian universe, because he says it's not just that you can't know what's going to happen. Knowledge of the present for us or for the demon itself is completely impossible, because if to know one of these two poles of knowledge, in the particular case of the particle, it might be time and energy, or it might be position and momentum, most famously position and momentum. To know one where the delta is down to zero, so absolutely perfect, means you have literally no idea of the other one, right? You don't, but neither does the demon. There is no way of knowing that. If that's the case, how can these two positions be reconciled? This was one of the most difficult things that I had to wrestle with, and it was my going back and reading Kant in a truly deep way to understand that Kant himself had already wrestled with that, even without anything approximating the mathematical and observational physics that led Heisenberg to be able to put this problem in neat mathematical notation, as he did in 1925 and then 1927 in his two most famous equations. Kant was intuiting this already. That's what the antinomies, that's what the whole second part of the Critique of Pure Reason is showing us, that essentially we can posit something like a Laplacian notion of the world. In fact, we can assume that is the absolute case. But in order to do so, any individual knowing that has to be God, and we can't possibly think like God. And in fact, not only that, God himself can't exist in the world like we can. So there's an absolute disjunction between those two positions, which means there ultimately is no mutual exclusion between the idea of a mechanistic world and freedom, because believing that there is means implicitly adopting a godlike perspective, which is in fact antithetical to human being per se.
Okay, fascinating. So it sounds like your reading basically allows for these contradictory viewpoints to all hold at the same time. That's going to be your answer to these questions about, is space continuous or discrete? Is there free will or is there mechanism? It sounds like the way this book cashes out and the way it cashes out in your own perspective is that these are durable antinomies. They're kind of on both sides of these paradoxes or these contradictions. Both sides are true, and that's kind of what's interesting about this. Is that fair to say, or is that too? Am I being too loose with
No,
my
no, I
words
think
there?
you're not being too loose at all. Durable antinomy is a really good way of putting it. When you think these problems, or whether you think them to their extreme or you observe them to their extreme, the antinomies of knowledge are going to emerge. There's no way to avoid that. They're going to emerge in poetics. That's what Borges shows. They're going to emerge in philosophy, which is what Kant had already first intuited in his early life and then ultimately rigorously went on to show. And then what Heisenberg did so amazingly was he showed that they were the result. You could actually put a mathematics to them. You could actually put numbers to them and calculate them. And that's the extraordinary thing that happens here. So to not speak too abstractly, we can go back to that question of the antinomy that arises between mechanistic knowledge of the world, right? The idea that every step that we take since we're living in a world in which one thing leads to another, and we're in the flow of mechanistic determination, hence something like free will must be impossible. And there are physicists with whom I debate in this book who absolutely believe that. Um, versus the idea that at each and every step along the way, as rational beings, we have a choice to make, right? I can believe in a mechanistic universe, but either right now I'm going to stay seated, or because I feel I'm a little bit stiff in my legs, I can make a decision and stand up. One or the other. It's my decision to make it. The determinist will say, yeah, your decision. All of these things are firing off in your brain. If we put some detectors into your brain, we could even have an AI that would be able to tell you microseconds before you've actually made the decision what you're going to do or not. What Kant realized, and actually he was not the first to realize it, but he put it into rigorous form, that philosophers since the Neoplatonics, in fact, had realized, was, this problem had all been worked out before. And the figure that I go back and talk about is Boethius. What Boethius said, and he didn't have any idea of an AI or any idea of brain, putting nodes in your brain and kind of having a machine figure out what you're going to be doing. But he came up with kind of a much better version than that, which is God himself, right? If God is all knowing, and God knows every step that every one of us is going to take throughout time, how in the world can we be said to be free? Well, he and all the other Neoplatonics came up with this extremely innovative answer that till today, it's very hard to grasp, which is, yeah, both can be absolutely true. There can be such a thing as a God, as an all-knowing God, just as we can assume something like a mechanistic universe that guides our actions from the beginning of time to the end of time. And perfectly compatible with that, and in fact is what philosophers call the compatibilist notion of free will. At each step along the way, free rational agents can be acting with more or less constraint in a way that is so to speak, undetermined. That we can make decisions that are our own to make. And how do we know that's true, or how do I make space for that within a completely deterministic universe, or within a predestined universe in the sense of God, or a God who knows every step of my motions from beginning up to the end of time? This is what Boethius said: for something like a God to exist and to know all time eternally from the beginning of the end, time doesn't exist for that being the same way that it does for us. It's not something that you're in. It's all at once. So yes, God, we can imagine, knows everything, but he knows it all at once at the same time. So every single move or decision we're doing so in an eternal present for God, which means it's perfectly compatible. God can be seeing everything that we're doing, and we're still free to be making those decisions. And there's absolutely no contradiction as long as you see it that way.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And if art is the way that we practically move through these antinomies, if artistic self-cultivation and artistic moving through the world is the way that we as human beings just find ways to move forward despite these antinomies, I'm curious to know your opinion about, in the kind of post-Borges period, who does this best? Who do you see as the most genius or brilliant artists, whether it's writers or in the plastic arts, or you answer however you want? Who takes these insights of Borges and Heisenberg and Kant and embodies them or dramatizes them most brilliantly after these kind of discoveries are made?
It's another great question, and we could just start listing and tossing ideas back and forth to each other. But and I'll give you some of my ideas, but do take with a grain of salt, and just know that these are the personal preferences and of someone with his own set of kind of obsessions and interests, and there's you can come from all sorts
Well,
of
that's what
different
I want to
directions,
know.
from all sorts of different cultures. What do I do in my evenings to relax? Often what I'm doing is I'm listening to jazz. So for me, some of the great jazz artists of the late 20th century, just yesterday, I was re-listening to some of John Coltrane's albums, for example. Blue Train, I told my kids, this for me is probably one of the greatest, if not the greatest albums ever made. I'm listening to the way that Coltrane and his musicians create patterns, what we could call rigor, out of seemingly nothing, right? They don't, each of them don't know exactly what the other is going to do, but they're listening and reacting. And out of that in the moment, listening and reacting, they've got an idea, they're following that idea, they're departing from it, they're coming back together again, and then they weave together out of time and out of rhythm and out of vibrations and sound, this extraordinary work of art that I want to revisit and revisit again. And each time my experience of it is, wow, God himself couldn't have made it more perfect than that. And yet what I'm witnessing is a pure act of human of creation. So like, that's just one example, but you're absolutely right. What does great art do? It reminds us over and over again that we sit at this juncture, at this pinnacle between these essentially these impossible pressures. One, that we are embodied in the world, that we're not a homunculus living behind the screen that's guiding our actions. We're actually, our intelligence, our creativity is always coming out of the moment. And yet there it is. It's still intelligence. It's still creativity. It's still anima in some way.
Hey everybody, this is just a quick interruption to invite you to the new Other Life community. We are now really moving in the direction of a network state. It's pretty crazy. We will give you a fully fledged personal server and a special desktop application from our partners at the Holium Company, which will let you and all of the members in the community compute together on the peer-to-peer sensor-proof Urbit network. It's still early, but it's insanely cool. If you're into the Other Life ethos, like if you're a writer or a software developer or whatever, if you're all about freedom and self-reliance outside of institutions, then we want to meet you. The community is now totally free to join. We have other ways now of filtering and sorting people later based on their abilities. It's kind of like the USA of the 1840s. Anyone could get on a ship and go to America, but only some would rise to ranks depending on what they were able to do. To join, just go to otherlife.co/join. That's otherlife.co/join.
One common theme on this podcast is that of the practical life of writers and thinkers. And your book is filled with lots of interesting biographical details. And you write in this kind of literary nonfiction style that leans very heavily on just the stories of these individuals' lives. So, we have a lot of writers in the audience, especially independent writers, whether it's people writing newsletters or podcasts or whatever, people kind of participating in the kind of independent cultural economy today. And I'm just kind of curious, from becoming more familiar with the lives of these three thinkers, was there anything that surprised you or stood out to you in terms of just how they conducted their work, how they built their projects, maybe even, this perennial difficulty that thinkers of all stripes always have of, managing the time dedicated to their work versus the time paying the bills and to their family. And these are questions that often come up in the podcast, and me and my audience are often studying and thinking about for our own purposes and navigating, the cultural economy today. Was there anything that surprised you about the lives of these three thinkers and how they conducted their work?
Yeah, so in fact, pretty much everything about each of their lives surprised me. Every step of the way that I went deeper into their lives, I would find things that I didn't expect. I began with a sort of surface knowledge of each of these characters. I knew much more about their writing in the case of Borges, or their physics in the case of Heisenberg, philosophy in the case of Kant, than I did about their lives. So for me, part of the fun of the exercise of writing the book was to really get to know them as characters. Who were the people who enabled such extraordinary creation, such extraordinary feats of the imagination, feats of the human intellect? And over and over again, I was just struck about how human they were, and how fallible, and how venal, and how petty, and how funny in so many ways. Borges, as I make clear from the beginning of the story, was just he was a miserable nebbish most of the time. I mean, he was just constantly in love, such a romantic. Most likely didn't actually have true, meaningful sex with a woman until much, much, much later in his life. And yet he was constantly, overwhelmingly, fatally in love with one woman after the other. And you think to yourself, someone who's spending all of this time just dwelling in kind of in the depths of his often negative emotions, how did he end up producing works like this? And really, you see that, well, they went hand in hand in a way, right? He was in some ways allowing his imagination to do what his imagination was able to do, and precisely because he was reaching out of the depths of his misery to try and grasp onto these anchors of in his case, he began to really think about problems of eternity and time and space, and then start to explore them as if he were himself a character in one of these mini science fictions that he was creating. In the case of Kant, you could really see, we all, anyone who studied philosophy knows sort of the basics of, Kant was such a steady character that you could set your watch to him by his walks in Königsberg, and that he didn't explore much beyond his world. But what was extremely gratifying to read about was what a man about town Kant was, how adored he was in Königsberg, how people looked up to him from early on, but also what a hypochondriac he was. Just constantly worried about his digestion, about his physical frailness, and yet he lived 30 years beyond some of his contemporaries. So he was in fact quite robust. Lived into a very old age, and very, in a very sad kind of tragic way, died at the end of a period of real senility. That he, the greatest mind of his generation, perhaps someone would say the greatest mind of any generation, suffered from Alzheimer's and stopped being able to remember things at the end of his life. And his urge to remember was so strong, he would go around writing everything down on pieces of paper in what ended up to be almost like a Dada dance of absurdity, with one little reminder left about another, and then left about another. And then Heisenberg was so athletic, so competitive. You would think that this guy was really, I say he's, some people talk about someone who's good at everything and really put their effort into everything and kind of outstanding and is a Boy Scout. Well, he literally was a Boy Scout, and he was a Boy Scout who others looked up to, and he would lead them on these expeditions when he was a young man, and an extraordinary skier. But on top of that, also could have been a concert pianist, and would even, as his career was blossoming, he would have evenings in which he would be playing beautiful piano pieces for his friends as they gathered around. Extremely well read. Of course, he could argue Kantian philosophy with the top philosophers in his own country, and at the same time could read ancient Greek philosophy. So one of the lessons that I came out of this with was, nowadays we train ourselves to be the best possible thinkers. When I say we, sort of university types, right? Our universities expect of us, and this is something that I've written about in some of my previous books as well, to be the best possible thinkers in some of the narrowest possible ways. But these great world-changing thinkers, and I don't just limit myself to the three of them, I talk about a lot of others in the book, as you know, but none of them were like that. They were really people who thought deeply about big questions in all sorts of ways, and they enriched their spirits and their intellects with art, with reading, with thought, with conversation, constant conversation. Heisenberg and his friends, they would ski, they would go out to diners and eat together. They would talk constantly about the biggest questions of physics at the time, to the point where the lady at the diner that they would go to sit around and talk would finally say, "Listen, you guys are going to have to stop talking about physics at the top of your lungs all the time, because it's driving my guests away."
I love that. This point about the kind of just authentic conviviality and the kind of just obsessively curious, joyful sociality involved in this kind of brilliant life of the mind, which is very hard to sustain for some people. And, you've, I think, done a pretty good job in your own career of maintaining a wide latitude of freedom for yourself, despite being an academic. And a lot of people really struggle with this, especially people who pursue academic careers, because, as you alluded to, all of the career incentives really are towards specialization. So maybe you could speak to this a little bit. What do you think in the current kind of technological, social, economic environment for scholars, thinkers, intellectuals of various kinds? What do you think are the keys to maintaining this kind of authentic, vivacious intellectual conviviality and curiosity and kind of generalist passion that you're describing, and which I think you've done a good job of maintaining for yourself. What's the trick to that? What's the key to that today?
Well, I think it's going to come down a lot to university leadership, right? And thank you very much for making that point about my own work. And it's something that I've been trying, really hard to do for a long time. But we often find in university settings in particular that you're fighting, you're swimming upstream when you're trying to make these points. And I understand. Look, in a lot of fields, one will say, if you're not just doing focused work on just on just this particular question, then the chances are that your own work is going to get outstripped. Someone's going to scoop you. Someone's going to make the next, major discovery in biomechanical engineering that's going to then set that department apart and make it the standard. And I get that. I get the pressures involved. At the same time, in particular in the fields that I represent, right, the humanities, it seems to me that we're doing ourselves a disservice when we try and model ourselves on that kind of a set of expectations. Because I really think what the humanities in particular have always been about is making connections, connecting what you're doing at this particular time with the greater world, and connecting with other people in both a convivial way, like you were saying, but in a persuasive way. It's teaching others, your students, for example, about argumentation, about discourse, about being open to other perspectives. And in some sense, and this is what the point that I was making in part in that book from 2018, The Splintering of the American Mind, is that there's a mirroring effect between hyper-specialization in academia and the fact that we have become less capable of talking to each other in the broader social, political field, right? The sense that, well, what we're really about is making ourselves more and more comfortable in our little worlds, as opposed to actually breaking out of those and challenging ourselves and making ourselves feel a little bit uncomfortable. So I think it's important to me, and I don't want to say that that it's important to me that everyone feel uncomfortable, like in my seminar or something like that. That's not what that is about. But it is about, like, to give you an example, I enjoy teaching this so much that I'm coming around and teaching almost the same thing again. It's a first year seminar around some of the issues that you and I are discussing today: poets, physicists, philosophers, and the ultimate nature of reality. And I would hold it for 2.5-hour sessions. Every week. These are 18 and 19-year-olds coming into this kind of an environment for the first time, sitting with me for 2.5 hours, and we get up at the end of the session. I'd be like, "Well, this is completely exhausting," and they'd say, "Yeah, but we need this, right? It's this 2.5-hour kind of existential crisis that we're facing every week, but we're doing it together and talking through these things and exposing ourselves and asking questions and wrestling with the biggest possible questions." This to me is what education is all about. But then, and this is the point that I wanted to make, it becomes a model not just for what education is all about. It's not just something that I'm trying to offer to the students per se. It's something for me, and a model for how I think we should be pursuing knowledge in the humanities altogether, which is exposing ourselves, in this particular case, not maybe just to each other in a seminar room, but exposing ourselves to new ways of thinking. We should be reading outside of our carefully curated boxes. We should be encountering art that shocks and undermines certain of our expectations. We should be exposing ourselves, to use that word again, in all sorts of intellectual and aesthetic ways. And I firmly believe that doing so is potentially, and perhaps even more than potentially, right? It's extremely beneficial for all walks of intellectual life, even those ones where we think we're serving ourselves better by staying micro-focused, by staying hyper-specialized. Because that's one of the lessons that we get from these great thinkers, in particular the ones that I discuss in the physical sciences. And as you know, I'm really exploring the world of early 20th century, the great generation of physicists. And these guys, yes, they were extremely good in that micro area that they worked on, but they were also deep thinkers. And that's sort of the point that I was getting at in those conversations among those physicists. They were constantly pushing each other's boundaries, and it's out of that pushing of boundaries that came these great insights.
I love it. I love it. And I completely agree. But I want to press you a little bit because I want to really press you on how to do that. Because when all of the incentives
Right.
are otherwise, it gets difficult for, because everyone likes to say what you just said, right? It's a very popular refrain, right? We all want to be generalists. We all want to challenge ourselves. We all want to be thinking outside of the box and thinking about the biggest ideas. And people love to talk like this, right? And I know that
Yeah.
you really mean it, but you've done a good job of actually doing it. And when push comes to shove, when the rubber hits the road each day and you wake up in the morning and you have to prioritize your life, and you can only do so much, most people don't do the things you're talking about. Most people will do what is most immediately, incentivized by their career structure, which often goes against what you're saying. So this is just what I want to press you on. What is the key to? What
Good.
are some keys or some tricks to actually putting your money where your mouth is, and going in the direction you're talking about when we live in a world where it's actually quite difficult for people?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and I'm glad you're pressing it on me. In fact, what I had started to say before getting sucked into my excitement of the example that I was from my own teaching was in it really often comes down, at least in the case of universities and incentives, as you were saying, incentives to work in particular ways, to university leadership and to convincing university leadership that a great deal of good can come out of precisely this kind of thing. Now, so the example that I give and that I talk a lot about in that previous book, The Splintering of the American Mind, is the adverse incentives that are built into our tenure system that guide us in a way, in particular in the humanities and social sciences, to value the work that we do along a very different kind of model. That different kind of model has to do with, as I was saying, there's a certain amount of understanding that I have in the physical science and medical sciences and biomechanical engineering. I cited that example because it's one of the very top programs of my own university, Johns Hopkins. Right, that if you're not really focusing on this one particular thing that you're working on, there's a very good chance that you might get scooped by another university. Someone else might come up with a discovery that's going to push the envelope and get us somewhere further. But the danger that we've come into by allowing tenure decisions and tenure pressures, in particular in the United States, to come in the humanities and social sciences, to follow that pattern and to rest on this kind of hyper specialization, is that you actually lose the essence of what the humanities and social sciences are all about, which is expansive knowledge, which is making connections. So when you're asking me, so how do we do this? Well, we do it by convincing administrators that this is the right thing to do. And by the way, this is not it's not a foregone conclusion that that message isn't getting through. In our own case at Hopkins, our current dean, who is a remarkable humanist who has also written for the public sphere, has made, in particular, the humanities and social sciences getting their message out to a broader public, one of the four pillars of his administration. So it's clearly something that is resonating and that's making a lot of sense. The own platform that I've had now for 7 years as the director of a humanities institute has that's really been written into the DNA of my institute for a long time. Is public humanities. Making not just educating the public, but having conversations in public spaces with people outside of the university is part of the core programming, is what we actually do. And my sense is, Justin, that this is starting to have inroads. Again, it's a sense that I'm getting from a relatively, like everyone is. I speak from my own four walls and where I am and everything like that. But that's the sense that I'm getting, is that message is coming through. One of the points I was making in that particular book was that it's essential that something like humanistic knowledge be as broad based as possible, in part because that's what democracy requires, right? It's having citizens who are not just informed about facts, but are able to be discerning about facts and able to have well well-researched and well-reasoned arguments about the facts. And this is essentially what we're doing in the humanities all the time. Then the president of my university ended up writing another book in which he was making very similar points about the absolute necessity of the liberal arts for something like a functioning democracy. The more voices that we have coming from the top in these university structures that are making that point, I think the harder and harder it becomes to ignore.
Okay. That's interesting. You mentioned a couple times now your book, The Splintering of the American Mind. I believe that's a allusion to Alan Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind. I'm curious, what did Alan Bloom get wrong chiefly? And what's
Well,
the difference between closing and splintering?
Yeah, it was. It was a sort of answer 30 years later to the closing of the American mind. And while I make an argument that the humanities are essential, which in his own way Alan Bloom was making in that, and Alan Bloom was making the point that that the American mind is closing because we're not expecting the students certain text anymore. My argument was very, very different, which was for one thing, the kind or the very specific set of texts that Alan Bloom was requiring of people. I think a lot of them are great. I think it's fantastic to read Rousseau, but exclusively reading Rousseau or reading Rousseau and not thinking about modern art or not adding or expanding the canon is also not, that's not salutary either. My point in this book was that the hyper specialization in academia, the fact that in higher education, we're in fact, on the one hand, talking about diversity and inclusion all the time, but in fact, we're making the most exclusive possible society you could imagine by making education out of reach financially for the vast majority of people who would like to have that kind of an education, that we're really working at odds and in different directions, working against ourselves and working against really a functioning and we're working against social justice. We're working against an actual functioning democracy. There's all sorts of things that we're in fact undermining by working in that direction, and splintering. So I'm not complaining about, in the same way as Alan Bloom is in that book, complaining about the forgetting of the fundamental texts of the Western canon. That's not really what the book's about. What the book's about is how we need to retool higher education in a way that focuses, that makes it more inclusive, open, and allows us to focus on the fundamental issues that we need, and the fundamental the quality of education that we need in order to be a functioning democracy.
My final couple of questions have to do with book publishing and writing and kind of the economy around it today. Obviously, the economy of publishing has changed tremendously in recent years, and you've been publishing books for quite a while. So I'm just curious to get your perspective on where things are right now. Obviously, Substack is very big right now. There are an increasing number of interesting writers and independent intellectuals who are building pretty impressive careers outside of institutions now. And I'm just curious what you make of this in contrast to the direction that book publishing has gone in. How has book publishing changed in the most important and interesting ways to you in recent years? It's kind of an open-ended question. I'm just curious about what you're seeing with all of this and what you make of it. For instance, are you ever tempted to buy the Substack model? What are the pros and cons? I'm just curious, what interests you about these questions today?
Right. So this is an excellent question, and it's excellent to me in part because I'm still learning so much about this. In some ways, I don't know whether I can say I hope not, or maybe it's good that everything changes. In some sense, it's always good that things are changing, but in some ways, I think I'm a representative of kind of the last wave of those who are writing books on kind of the old model. What do I mean by the old model? That you get, after a lot of hard work, you work on your own writing. And by the way, by what I mean on books, of course, are the kind of narrative nonfiction that, as you pointed out, that I specialize in. In my particular case, on kind of heady intellectual topics. You work a lot on your own writing. You get to the point where you attract the attention of an agent who has some serious sway in New York, of course. You work on eventually a proposal with that agent. You finally get it somewhere where you want it to be. The agent sends it out to some of the big presses, you get a number of presses interested, and then eventually you get an offer, and then you write that book, and then you see what happens. And all of this I did, it was the way you were supposed to do it, more or less at the time when the publishing industry was starting to get into the deepest trouble that it's ever had. And I've had multiple conversations with Michael Carlisle, my agent, about this. And he's that kind of an agent who loves the big book with the meaty ideas. And he's always telling me we're having more and more problems selling these. And I don't know what the future is going to be like. And as you're pointing out, I think there's good reasons and potentially problematic reasons for that. And the problematic side would be the question of reading itself, right? What is the future of that practice that I hold so dear, that's so important to me, that I also try and inculcate in students still, which is like hold an actual book in your hands and spend time reading it and just digging into those ideas and staying with them for a while, versus something that I do all the time as well, like everyone does today, very quickly going through massive amounts of stuff online for, ideas or information, such and such and such. So there is that. And the other is, potentially the upside to it. New forms of information, new forms of reading that are emerging that I'm, not so up to date on. And that in a way I sometimes question myself, like, what am I missing out on by being in that sense a dinosaur, being someone who's stuck on a little bit in that model. So when the time comes, a book like mine is about to come out, and I can start having conversations in this mode. I'm talking with someone who's producing a successful podcast. This is interesting to me because it introduces me as well to new venues for information and conversation to be coming out. Substack, you're hitting me with something I only just recently started finding out about because, at a conference, I would go and give a lecture, and afterwards someone would say, well, we should have a Substack about this. And I was, yeah, whatever that is, I got to go find out what that is. Right. And so, and the one social media that I tried to stay up on a little bit is Twitter, because I was told, 5 or 6 years ago when, it was longer than that now, when The Man Who Invented Fiction came out, well, you need to have a Twitter account. And so I did that, and been kind of every once in a while slowly posting things and bit by bit growing the readership. And now people are wondering, well, is that over now? Is that even the way to go anymore? I don't know. These are all good questions, man.
Yeah, sure. It's fascinating to hear how you think about it. Because sociologically nowadays I'm much more embedded in the crowd that pays most attention to this kind of stuff and is all into podcasts and newsletters. And yeah, I hang out with a lot of people who are deep in that world nowadays, as am I. But I used to be a professor, and so my sociology used to be people much more like yourself, and so it's just fascinating how these different worlds can coexist. But you've had a brilliant career in your own model, and you've done very well for yourself. So frankly, there's not much need for you to pay too much attention to these other new models. And I don't think you need to. So I was just curious, as someone who's had an intimate relationship with the publishing industry for a while now. I just figured, it's well known that there are many interesting trends going on, as you alluded to. It's increasingly difficult for especially new kind of early career writers working in kind of provocative narrative nonfiction. It's a pretty hard sell, and I think it's an increasingly hard sell, which you alluded to. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of ask you that open-ended question to see if there were any interesting angles or observations that you've had in your experience that might interest my audience.
Yeah. The one other thing that I would add, and this is something almost more from my from my academic colleagues, and I do tell them, and we do run workshops on non-academic writing, and we talk a lot about what do you have to do in order to successfully get your ideas out in the public sphere. And the consistent prejudice that you encounter in academia all the time is that, well, it's like a trade-off, right? That it's, to use the worst possible term for it, dumbing down. Are you really going to have to dumb down your ideas in order to get them out there in a way? And I think this is so wrong-headed. I can't even tell you. And what I tell my, my colleagues all the time is, writing, because I still do both, right? I'll switch back and forth between a more academic book that's going to go, straight to an academic audience. I've got one coming out actually in a couple of months in Bloomsbury's series on philosophical filmmakers about the Chilean surrealist Alejandro Jodorowsky. So what do I mean by it's a more academic book? Fundamentally, the difference, is the following. It's not going to be edited in the same way. It's largely going to run through a peer review. And as long as I'm convincing to a couple of my colleagues out there, and, I'm not denigrating the process at all. They like the work. That's great. I'm excited to get it out. That's great as well. But it goes through nothing like the kind of rigor that of the relationship between a really good editor like I have at Pantheon and myself. Draft after draft after draft, in which not only the level of expression is broken down and thought about and worked over and put through the ringer, but the ideas themselves. To go back to that term, the rigor of the ideas. I honestly think there is no comparison in terms of the difficulty of the process of writing between writing an academic book, what I would call sort of in easy shorthand, an academic book, and a trade book, like a book for the presses that I write when I write these big books for public audiences. It's a lot more work, and it's ultimately a much bigger feeling of pride on my part when I've gotten it out, because I know how much harder I've worked on it. Right. And I think that's an important message to get out there. Yeah. Writing for the general public is not dumbing down. It's smartening up, honestly.
Love it. Love it. Yeah. Never dumb down your ideas, no matter who you're writing for. It's awesome. William, thank you so much. The book is The Rigor of Angels. By the time you're listening to this podcast or watching it on YouTube, the book will be out. So you can go buy it on Amazon or wherever you buy your books. Bill, thank you so much. It's a pleasure getting to know you. I'm really happy to have had you on. And I just want to thank you for your time.
Thank you, Justin. It was a real pleasure talking to you too. You take care.